Episode 31.
What if Christianity actually teaches peace and not preventive wars of aggression?
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
I'm rising up with a full heart. I'm taking my strength from inside. I'm rising up with a new mind. I'm taking your words to the new reality.
Have you heard the infamous Ron Paul speech known as What If? Today, I'd like to spend a little time to examine each of the points he makes in the speech. It was an eye-opener for me, as I'm sure it was with most of you. But whether you haven't heard it before, or if you're familiar with it, I think this will be a valuable examination of a pivotal moment in my political understanding. First off, this speech is only about 3.5 minutes, and it was delivered on the Senate floor February of 2009. So, more than 10 years ago. And maybe you're rolling your eyes here, but this speech is just as pertinent today as it was then, considering we are still fighting the same wars and using the same tired excuses that Dr. Ron Paul brings up. Like I said, it's only about 3.5 minutes long, so let's take that time to listen to it in its entirety before we get into each of the details.
I have a few questions for my colleagues. What if our foreign policy of the past century is deeply flawed and has not served our national security interests? What if we wake up one day and realize that the terrorist threat is a predictable consequence of our meddling in the affairs of others and has nothing to do with us being free and prosperous? What if propping up repressive regimes in the Middle East endangers both the United States and Israel? What if occupying countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and bombing Pakistan is directly related to the hatred directed toward us? What if someday it dawns on us that losing over 5,000 American military personnel in the Middle East since 9/11 is not a fair trade-off for the loss of nearly 3,000 American citizens, no matter how many Iraqi, Pakistani, and Afghan people are killed or displaced? What if we finally decide that torture, even if called enhanced interrogation technique, is self-destructive and produces no useful information, and that contracting it out to a third world nation is just as evil? What if it is finally realized that war and military spending is always destructive to the economy? What if all wartime spending is paid for through the deceitful and evil process of inflating and borrowing? What if we finally see that wartime conditions always undermine personal liberty? What if conservatives who preach small government wake up and realize that our interventionist foreign policy provides the greatest incentive to expand the government? What if conservatives understood once again that their only logical position is to reject military intervention in managing an empire throughout the world? What if the American people woke up and understood that the official reasons for going to war are almost always based on lies and promoted by war propaganda in order to serve special interests? What if we as a nation came to realize that the quest for empire eventually destroys all great nations? What if Obama has no intention of leaving Iraq? What if a military draft is being planned for the war that will spread if our foreign policy is not changed? What if the American people learn the truth, that our foreign policy has nothing to do with national security, that it never changes from one administration to the next? What if war and preparation for war is a racket serving the special interests? What if President Obama is completely wrong about Afghanistan and turns out worse than Iraq and Vietnam put together? What if diplomacy is found to be superior to bombs and bribes in protecting America? What happens if my concerns are completely unfounded? Nothing. But what happens if my concerns are justified and ignored? Nothing good.
So, what if? This could be the first time you're thinking about this. I admit, even though this is a powerful few minutes, not many people are sitting around watching C-SPAN for its riveting content. But once you sit through it, I'm sure it resonates with you the same way it did with me. The moment that struck me the most was this question, what if Christianity actually teaches peace and not preventative wars of aggression? This moment hit me like a ton of bricks. And, unfortunately, it was years after Ron originally delivered it, but it is timeless. And, unfortunately, we are still faced with the same war and the same what-ifs. So, that's why I think it's worth the time to look into these what-ifs. This might even help you when talking about the same issues today. It's easy to get lost in any soundbite longer than 30 seconds, so let's sit back for a little history and philosophy that this speech is rich with. So, Ron Paul starts off the 2009 speech with, what if our foreign policy of the past century is deeply flawed and has not served our national security interest? You could spend months digging into this. I'll try to keep it brief. Firstly, I think a good place to start is with exposing that the current foreign policy of the United States is not the original foreign policy. One of George Washington's better quotes comes from his farewell address. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world. The inaugural pledge of Thomas Jefferson was just as important a statement. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Both of these comments set a good policy for the United States that is commonly summed up as no entangling alliances. The flawed past that Dr. Paul refers to can be tracked not far from these two speeches from Washington and Jefferson, but where the U.S.'s current frame of mind really jumps into high gear is at the turn of the 20th century. Starting with the Spanish-American War and the bloody conquest of the Philippines, the U.S. has not only been entangled with other countries like the U.K., Israel, and Saudi Arabia, but has also been self-serving in Asia and South America. I'll have some books referenced in the show notes for all the events I'm referencing. So on to the next point. What if we wake up one day and realize that the terrorist threat is the predictable consequence of our meddling in the affairs of others and has nothing to do with us being free and prosperous? This is best summed up in the term blowback, and it's a direct contradiction to what we were told by the Bush administration and George Bush himself. And Dr. Paul was the prevailing voice on the subject during his 2008 presidential campaign. There is a famous debate in 2007 that is commonly referred to as the Giuliani Moment, where he acknowledged the U.S.'s blowback in front of a national audience. And it was the first time many people had heard that or, just heard somebody else speak it. And this is the moment for many people in the libertarian community today. So let's listen to that Giuliani moment for a minute.
Congressman Paul, I believe you are the only man on the stage who opposes the war in Iraq, who would bring the troops home as quickly as almost immediately, sir. Are you out of step with your party? Is your party out of step with the rest of the world? If either of those is the case, why are you seeking its nomination?
Well, I think the party has lost its way because the conservative wing of the Republican Party always advocated a non-interventionist foreign policy. Senator Robert Taft didn't even want to be in NATO. George Bush won the election in year 2000 campaigning on a humble foreign policy, no nation building, no policing of the world. Republicans were elected to end the Korean War. The Republicans were elected to end the Vietnam War. There's a strong tradition of being anti-war in the Republican Party. It is the constitutional position. It is the advice of the founders to follow a non-interventionist foreign policy. Stay out of entangling alliances. Be friends with countries. Negotiate and talk with them and trade with them. Just think of the tremendous improvement relationships with Vietnam. We lost 60,000 men. We came home in defeat. Now we go over there and invest in Vietnam. So there's a lot of merit to the advice of the founders and following the Constitution. And my argument is that we shouldn't go to war so carelessly. When we do, the wars don't end.
Congressman, you don't think that changed with the 9/11 attack, sir?
What changed?
The non-interventionist policies.
No, non-intervention was a major contributing factor. Have you ever read about the reasons they attacked us? They attack us because we've been over there. We've been bombing Iraq for 10 years. We've been in the Middle East. I think Reagan was right. We don't understand the irrationality of Middle Eastern politics. So right now we're building an embassy in Iraq that's bigger than the Vatican. We're building 14 permanent bases. What would we say here if China was doing this in our country or in the Gulf of Mexico? We would be objecting. We need to look at what we do from the perspective of what would happen if somebody else did it to us.
Are you suggesting we invited the 9/11 attack, sir?
I'm suggesting that we listen to the people who attacked us and the reason they did it. And they are delighted that we're over there because Osama bin Laden has said, I am glad you're over on our sand because we can target you so much easier. They've already now, since that time, have killed 3,400 of our men, and I don't think it was necessary.
Wendell, may I make a comment on that? That's really an extraordinary statement. It's an extraordinary statement as someone who lived through the attack of September 11, that we invited the attack because we were attacking Iraq. I don't think I've ever heard that before, and I've heard some pretty absurd explanations for September 11. I would ask the congressman to withdraw that comment and tell us that he didn't really mean that.
Congressman?
I believe very sincerely that the CIA is correct when they teach and talk about blowback. When we went into Iran in 1953 and installed the Shah, yes, there was blowback. The reaction to that was the taking of our hostages, and that persists. And if we ignore that at our own risk. That if we think that we can do what we want around the world and not incite hatred, then we have a problem. They don't come here to attack us because we're rich and we're free. They come and they attack us because we're over there. I mean, what would we think if we were if other foreign countries were doing that to us?
Can I have 30 seconds, please?
No, wait a second. We'll all get 30 seconds.
So I cannot emphasize enough how big of a moment this was. And I think it should still resonate with people today. And, unfortunately, be just as controversial and relevant. As Scott Horton likes to say, most Americans think history started with 9/11. All right, then. The next point. What if propping up repressive regimes in the Middle East endangers both the United States and Israel? This might be a shocker to most Americans today. In a time when we can't seem to stop debating the possible effects of Russian collusion and election interference, most people don't seem to realize it's been U.S. policy to overthrow and insert selected regimes for a while. It's been commonplace in South America and other island nations, but specifically here, Dr. Paul is referencing the Middle East. Starting in 1949, we have multiple attempts in Syria through the 1950s, the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, Operation Straggle, and Operation Wapen. We have Project FF in Egypt, 1952, Operation TP Ajax in 1953 with Iran, 1958's Operation Blue Bat in Lebanon, and Iraq in 1959, 1963, and the early 1970s. Afghanistan's Operation Cyclone through the 1980s, In the 1990s, we saw lobbying for Kuwait and the invasion of Iraq, which pretty much brings us to our perpetual involvement in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria in the 2000s. Again, this is strictly the Middle East interventions and does not include Guatemala, Hawaii, Honduras, Cuba, Indonesia, etc., etc. And keep in mind, none of this is a dreaded conspiracy theory. Ooh, scary, right? This is documented conspiracy fact. And I'll have links in the show notes to everything that you need to look into it for further research, to look into it yourself. And please do. This is real, documented, unclassified material from the United States government. What if occupying countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and bombing Pakistan is directly related to the hatred directed toward us? Now, this should be obvious from the interventions and the blowback mentioned already. So, what if someday it dawns on us that losing over 5,000 American military personnel in the Middle East since 9/11 is not a fair trade-off with the loss of nearly 3,000 American citizens, no matter how many Iraqi, Pakistani, and Afghan people are killed or displaced? This is essentially heresy in post-9/11 United States. I even used to take offense to it before I just sat down and looked at the point. It's a hard point, but it's solid. What's the point of our involvement? What constitutes victory and adequate punishment? It's also a big point today about refugees. How do we handle them? Or are we causing terror? Regardless how we want to handle these questions, it is unavoidable that whatever problems there are a direct result of the interventions in their homelands. What if we finally decide that torture, even if called enhanced interrogation technique, is self-destructive and produces no useful information, and that contracting it out to a third world nation is just as evil? This is something that seems to be only rhetorically relevant. If the government is doing it, it must be working, right? But when is this ever the case? Why do we ignore every inclination of government failure when it comes to our involvement in foreign affairs? It takes a special indoctrination or ignorance to ignore the horrors or blowback from Abu Ghraib. And I can say that because, sadly, I was an apologist for it once. What if it is finally realized that war and military spending is always destructive to the economy? What if all wartime spending is paid for through the deceitful and evil process of inflating and borrowing? So I will direct you to an article from Murray Rothbard titled "The Economics of War" on Mises.org. In short, it is the myth and fallacy that war is good for the economy. I know you've probably all heard that before. We've all heard that war brings countries out of economic depressions. But if you get rich and the obvious stimulus is a distraction from the greater loss created from the war. What if we finally see that wartime conditions always undermine personal liberty? What if conservatives who preach small government wake up and realize that our interventionist foreign policy provides the greatest incentive to expand the government? I think both of these points go hand in hand, and expanded government necessitates a loss of personal liberty. Directly after the invasion of Iraq after 9/11, the United States citizens underwent numerous losses of liberty. We accepted this without question because of fear for our safety from politicians' speeches and their media propaganda arm. From warrantless wiretapping to the growth of the surveillance state, torture, kidnapping, detention, and other abuses under the Patriot Act, the American people readily accepted anything to quench the fear of a terror attack. But the quote from Benjamin Franklin warns and prophesies accurately. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. I'll add that in post 9/11 America, even though we've become very comfortable with our losses, we see that you lose both. What if conservatives understood once again that their only logical position is to reject military intervention and managing an empire throughout the world? I think the Giuliani Moment answered that point too. What if the American people woke up and understood that the official reasons for going to war are almost always based on lies and promoted by war propaganda in order to serve special interest? So there's a common expression: never let a good crisis go to waste. Unfortunately, it has been uttered and followed through with all too often from the United States politicians. This is where we are accused of being tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists, but this quote remains, and Dr. Paul is spot on here. Again, let's talk conspiracy fact. Smedley Butler exposed in the early 1900s that war is a racket. I'll have the link to the episode that I did on Smedley Butler and his book War is a Racket in the show notes. He was a major exposure to the banana republics of Honduras and Guatemala, where the U.S. military stepped in on behalf of private fruit companies. There was also the fake Gulf of Tonkin incident leading to the Vietnam War. Also, the failed before it even started Operation Northwoods, where the CIA proposed to commit acts of terrorism on American civilians to inspire public contempt, which would later lead to the allowance for interventions with Cuba during the Cold War. But President Kennedy would veto this prior to his assassination. And the list, unfortunately, goes on and on. And again, these are documented incidences, documented from our own government. So it's not a conspiracy theory. What if we as a nation came to realize that the quest for empire eventually destroys all great nations? So you may see varying statistics showing the average life of an empire is between 200 and 400 years. In that time, the story is always the same. No nation seeking empire is immune from inflation or overexpansion of its military, and the political corruption that will eventually lead to its end. This was the case for Rome then, and we are seeing it play out with the U.S. today. What if Obama has no intention of leaving Iraq? Yep, that didn't happen either. Obama, like Bush and Trump and even other presidents, making campaign promises to draw down troops or get the country out of pointless wars, just stays in and grows the war instead of getting out. Whether the American people realize it or not, they go through the same thing every election cycle. They say, yeah, we shouldn't be the world's police. But then as soon as that president gets in and a new event happens that requires us to stay longer or create a new war, then they say, yeah, we have to do it for our security. It's the same thing over and over again. What if a military draft is being planned for the wars that would spread if our foreign policy is not changed? The draft is something that feels far away because of the size of the volunteer military that we have today. However, in the last few years, there have been plenty of stats released showing the volunteering slowing. Personally, I think younger generations are becoming increasingly skeptical of the war on terror. We're at the point that new recruits were actually born after the fall of the trade towers, the catalyst of the endless wars today. In the past 10 or so years, to mitigate the slowdown, we've seen serious looks at including women into the once male-only draft. These are all signs pointing toward using the draft again, making it bigger, including more people, What if the American people learned the truth, that our foreign policy has nothing to do with national security, that it never changes from one administration to the next? Digging in and learning all the stuff that I've gone over already is essentially what he's talking about. And we learned of the military-industrial complex from Eisenhower's farewell speech. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. What if war, in preparation for war, is a racket serving the special interest? So Smedley Butler showed us this about 30 years before Eisenhower's speech. What if President Obama is completely wrong about Afghanistan and it turns out worse than Iraq and Vietnam put together? Just in the total number of deaths, Vietnam far outweighs Iraq and Afghanistan. But Afghanistan has long been called the graveyard of empires. The British spent about 80 years and multiple wars there, and the Soviets failed at their 10-year attempt throughout the 80s. Do we really think the 2 decades that the U.S. is spending there will be any different? What if Christianity actually teaches peace and not preventative wars of aggression? And here's the line that really struck a chord with me. And I know I'm not the only one. It really caused me to look at passages from the Bible, like the Sermon on the Mount, and compare it to the foreign policy of the United States that I excused. It's unfortunate today that most conservative Christians can give a lengthy defense for initiating preventative wars, but blow off, "Blessed are the peacemakers," "Love your enemies," not worrying and trusting in God, turning the other cheek, forgiving those who trespass against us, and treating others the way that we want to be treated. I remember also in Ron Paul's campaign that he brought up the Golden Rule when talking about foreign policy, and he was booed by Christian conservatives.
Andrew Jackson had a pretty clear-cut idea about America's enemies. Kill them. Congressman Paul, 30 seconds, please. 30 seconds to respond, since you were mentioned.
My point is if another country does to us what we do others, we're not going to like it very much. So I would say that maybe we ought to consider a golden rule in foreign policy. Don't do to other nations what we don't want to have them do to us. So we endlessly bomb these countries, and then we wonder why they get upset with us, and yet it continues on and on. I mean, this idea that we can't debate foreign policy, then all we have to do is start another war. I mean, it's warmongering. They're building up for another war against Iran, and people can't wait to get in another war. This country doesn't need another war. We need to quit the ones we're in. We need to save the money and bring our troops home.
What if diplomacy is found to be superior to bombs and bribes in protecting America? Humorously, we've seen several countries in the last few years making arrangements outside of U.S. threats and sanctions and war. It reminds me of another great statement from Ron Paul about Syria. He said, they're terrified that peace was going to break out. Unfortunately, the United States is intent on bombs and bribes to bend other countries to its will, and has convinced its citizens that this is not only the best method, but also necessary for its national defense. What happens if my concerns are completely unfounded? Nothing. But what happens if my concerns are justified and ignored? Nothing good. And there you have it. Are Ron Paul's concerns completely unfounded? Obviously they weren't, and his concerns were justified. And obviously, The continuing of the failing or dangerous programs during the time he delivered this speech shows that they were ignored. The nothing good he mentions can be measured in 22 veteran suicides a day, the growth of domestic surveillance, and accelerating inflation. All right, I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope it rejuvenated an interest and an understanding of the importance of Ron Paul's speeches in the early 2000s, and really just how important Ron Paul has been overall. Don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. Also, like and share the episode on Facebook or the other social media sites. You can also support the show with a one-time or monthly donation through Patreon. Thank you, Mark, for becoming our newest patron. If anyone else is interested, visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page, where you'll find a few ways that you can support us. So with that, grace and peace, no king but Christ.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.